For more than a month now, Ukraine has been at the epicenter of a real conflict. Only this time, its opponent is not in the east, but in the west.
And thank God, so far it hasn't involved guns, casualties, or bloodshed.
The largest political and diplomatic confrontation in decades has erupted between Poland and Ukraine. And the scandal is not only far from being resolved, but on the contrary, it keeps intensifying. At first glance, everything revolves around fundamentally opposite models of historical memory, Ukrainian and Polish. More specifically, the part that concerns the activities of the Ukrainian National Liberation Movement during World War II, better known by the collective name UPA. And to be completely precise, it concerns the so-called Volhynia tragedy, whose victims included both Poles and Ukrainians. But today we're going to dig deeper and take a look at the very essence of the current Polish-Ukrainian conflict. My name is Seaman. This is the Mega Show television channel. Let's begin. The Volhynia tragedy. What's the gist of it? Actually, such a slippery and very complicated topic deserves at least a separate video, or better yet, several. However, for now, let's try to understand this issue as briefly as possible. Let's start with a bit of history. During the period between the two world wars, that is, from 1919 to 1939, the territory of Galicia and Volhynia was part of Poland. And mind you, these are 5 present-day regions: Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Ternopil, Rivne, and Volyn. But right now, we are interested in the last 2.
Of course, all these Ukrainian lands became part of Poland, or as it was called then, the Second Polish Republic, not voluntarily, but were seized by force, annexed. Accordingly, the Poles' attitude toward Ukrainians was like that toward a conquered people, like second-class people. Thank God, unlike Hitler, the Polish authorities did not exterminate Ukrainians like they did the Jews. And they didn't send them to the Gulag like Stalin did, but all kinds of discrimination against the Ukrainian population, both on an everyday level and on a political administrative level, did exist. And at that time, it was the norm for the Poles. But again, the Poles did not build death camps like Auschwitz or Buchenwald.
Nevertheless, there was still one small concentration camp in Bereza-Kartuska. All political prisoners were sent there, including members of the Ukrainian National Liberation Movement.
For example, the future commander-in-chief of the UPA, Roman Shukevich, was imprisoned there, and so was Vasil, the brother of Stepan Bandera.
And in general, for the sake of historical truth, it should be noted that Poland in the 1920s and 1930s, especially during the rule of Joseph Pilsudski, hardly resembled a democratic state.
On the contrary, it was more of a personalist authoritarian regime with clearly far-right and even pro-fascist tendencies. Not like fascist Germany, of course, but more like Mussolini's dictatorship in Italy or Miklos Horthy's in Hungary. You will soon understand that this fact played a very important role.
But then came the ominous year of 1939. First, Hitler and Stalin divided Poland according to the world-famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And less than a month later, the division of Poland happened on the ground as well. Volhynia and Galicia went to the Soviet Empire. But in 1941, these lands, and not only them, were seized by the Third Reich. At the same time, both the Polish and Ukrainian populations of Volhynia remained in place. They continued to live quite well, closely together. Many villages had mixed populations. And it was not always clear what the average resident's nationality was, Polish or Ukrainian.
And now we come to the very essence of the Volhynian tragedy. To put it as briefly and simply as possible, during the German occupation of Volhynia, specifically from 1942 to 1944, a series of armed conflicts broke out between the local Polish and Ukrainian populations, which led to the mass killing of civilians, including children, and the destruction of their property. On the Polish side, the fighters of the underground Home Army were responsible. And on the Ukrainian side, the UPA, as well as a number of other Ukrainian nationalist units. The peak of the killings occurred in the summer of 1943, after which they began to decline. And now the difference in the interpretation of these events begins. The Poles promote a simple and clear narrative similar to the Holocaust. It comes down to the idea that the damned Banderites, as well as their sympathizers, deliberately and ruthlessly destroyed, literally massacred the Polish population of Volhynia, especially the elderly, women, and children. That is, from the Polish point of view, all these events are pure genocide, similar to the already mentioned Holocaust or the killing of Armenians by the Turks during World War I.
The official position of Ukraine is that yes, the killings of Poles did indeed take place, but the Poles themselves also killed Ukrainian civilians, and most often they were the first to kill, and then the Ukrainians carried out acts of retaliation. Thus, from the point of view of Ukrainian historians, the killings in Volhynia were not genocide, meaning the one-sided extermination of Poles based on nationality, but rather mutual ethnic cleansing, that is, war crimes committed during a two-sided conflict. Actually, that's why
Unlike in Poland, where the term Volhynian massacre is commonly used, in Ukraine the term Volhynian tragedy is used as a matter of principle. In this way, it is specifically emphasized that all these killings were by their nature a tragedy and not genocide. A tragedy for both peoples. As a result, Ukraine insists that Ukrainians most often acted in retaliation for similar killings committed by the Poles. That is, as the main characters in the movie Rambo say, they drew first blood. Plus, of course, the element of revenge played a significant role in all of this, as well as the feeling of striving for justice after all the previous years of humiliation and repression by the Poles.
And on top of all that, most Ukrainian historians agree that their Polish colleagues clearly exaggerate the number of victims.
Not 100,000 Poles killed, but approximately 10 to 15,000 at most, 20,000 plus, about the same number of Ukrainians killed.
To sum up, the Polish version about the one-sided guilt of Ukrainian nationalists is opposed by the Ukrainian version, which speaks of shared responsibility.
After all, both sides committed war crimes against civilians.
And since the main participants of the Volhynia tragedy, the UPA and the Home Army, primarily fought against the Nazi occupation, it is quite logical that in their own countries they are considered heroes and fighters for freedom.
But at the same time, their glorification often only worsens mutual accusations. However, let's take it step by step.
Everything revolves around July 11.
Before getting to the heart of the current Polish-Ukrainian conflict, it should be said that for almost 70 years, the Volhynia tragedy was among the little-studied, undesirable, and even semi-forbidden topics, not just for academic research, but even for broad public and political discussion. During the Soviet period, this issue was completely taboo. The ideological concept of socialist cooperation and friendship among peoples required hiding any sharp conflicts between Poles, Ukrainians, and other peoples of the socialist bloc.
And after the fall of the communist dictatorship in Poland and Ukraine's gaining independence, the first decades passed under the slogan, "Without an independent Ukraine, there is no independent Poland."
Accordingly, the most important component of the policy of the then Polish elites was the desire to pull Ukraine out of Russia's sphere of influence and gradually integrate it into Western structures, into the EU and NATO. Therefore, for the sake of such a strategic goal, the Polish authorities deliberately set aside historical claims in order not to spoil relations with Kyiv.
Especially wise and balanced policies were pursued by Presidents Aleksander Kwaśniewski and Bronislaw Komorowski, who were aligned with pro-European liberal democratic forces.
That is why, even 15 or 20 years ago, Poland was openly called Ukraine's main advocate in Europe. The situation changed dramatically in 2015-2016, when right-wing conservative and even openly far-right political forces began to govern Poland.
For the first time since the early 90s, all the power, that is, the presidency, the prime minister's post, and the parliamentary majority, was concentrated in the hands of the largest right-wing party, Law and Justice.
And that's when it all started.
Polish conservatives very quickly turned the Volhynia tragedy into the main unifying topic for Polish society. And they did it completely artificially, just chasing political points. And although in almost all countries right-wing forces pay significant attention to historical memory, in Poland this escalation exceeded all expectations. Specifically to spite Ukraine, the Sejm officially declared July 11 as the National Day of Remembrance for the victims of the genocide of Polish citizens by Ukrainian nationalists. Because, according to research by Polish historians, it was on this day in 1943 that the largest number of murders of Polish residents occurred.
At the international level, Polish authorities have been increasingly demanding that Ukrainians repent for what happened and admit their guilt in the Volhynia tragedy, just as the Germans did for the Holocaust.
Also, leading Polish politicians such as Jarosław Kaczyński have started making open threats, saying that with Bandera and the UPA, Ukraine has no chance of joining the European Union.
Plus, as the cherry on top, the Poles specifically made an openly anti-Ukrainian propaganda film called Volhynia, where Ukrainian nationalists were portrayed almost as cannibals, and compared to them, the Germans and Soviets looked pretty harmless, like sweethearts. It's pure idiocy, that's all I can say. However, when this idiocy is presented as a deliberate state policy, it's clearly no laughing matter, and that's true for both Poles and Ukrainians. A shower of awards in Russia. Asgar.
Now let's move on to today. The formal reason for the current conflict was Volodymyr Zelensky naming a separate Special Operations Center North after the heroes of the UPA. No one in Ukraine paid any attention to this decision at all, which is not surprising. There are plenty of other problems.
Moreover, over the past 10 years, as part of decommunization and decolonization, streets, avenues, and squares named after Stepan Bandera, Shukevich, and other figures of Ukrainian nationalism and UPA fighters have appeared on the maps of many Ukrainian cities. And nothing happened.
No one in Warsaw reacted to this.
To be fair, it should be said that tensions in Poland rise around July 11 almost every year. As this date approaches, Polish politicians start bringing up the Volhynia tragedy. And afterwards, the topic gradually dies down, turning into ordinary media noise. And so it goes until the next summer. That's why at first, when the Poles just started stirring things up, Kyiv didn't take the threat seriously. The situation changed when the president of Poland, Karl Nawrocki, personally got involved.
By a special decree, he stripped Volodymyr Zelensky of Poland's highest award, the Order of the White Eagle, which had been granted by the previous president, Andrzej Duda, 3 years earlier.
In diplomatic terms, such a gesture is an outright insult, and not just to Volodymyr Zelensky personally, but to the entire Ukrainian people on whose behalf he actually speaks. And I want to emphasize specifically that this is a people at war, a people fighting against a common enemy of both Ukrainians and Poles.
In response to such an unprecedented demarche, as a sign of solidarity with the head of state, Ukrainian politicians and public figures, including former presidents, began to renounce Polish awards. Leonid Kuchma, Viktor Yushchenko, and Petro Poroshenko renounced their orders of the White Eagle.
Officials of lower rank, such as Kirylo Budanov, also publicly renounced their Polish awards, including military ones.
But it didn't stop with just refusing the orders. Ukraine was hit by a new wave of criticism, as well as outright insults and threats from Poland.
And first of all, there were demands to block negotiations on Ukraine's accession to the EU and NATO, as well as to stop any assistance, including military aid.
Some Polish politicians demonstratively refer to Western Ukraine as Eastern Lesser Poland, which is by default seen as thinly veiled territorial claims by Warsaw against Kyiv.
And that's not even the end of it. As mentioned earlier, this conflict is only heating up, gaining more and more momentum. In Moscow, at this time, they are openly rubbing their nasty little hands together because if there is no unity among the allies, then there is no need for an enemy.
Friendship is friendship, but business is business.
So looking at all this political chaos, you ask yourself a simple yet very complicated question. Are all the reasons for the current Polish-Ukrainian confrontation really below the belt? Pardon me, it comes down exclusively to the Volhynia tragedy. So it turns out that it's all because of the completely opposite views on events that happened 80 years ago. And if that's the case, is it really impossible to step over these problems of such a distant past for the sake of building a bright future within a united European family? Or are we talking about some other, more pressing issues? And the Volhynia tragedy is nothing more than the tip of the iceberg, the most visible, but by no means the most important.
So let's first recall the painfully familiar formula. Any idea inevitably dies if it no longer serves an economic interest. So if you look at the problem from the economic perspective, everything quickly falls into place. After all, while in political and military political spheres, Poland and Ukraine are inevitable allies because they have a common enemy, Russia. In terms of economics, Ukraine and Poland are 100% competitors. Just remember the events of 2023 when Polish farmers massively blocked border checkpoints and Ukrainian trucks loaded with grain and other agricultural products. They stood at the border for weeks in queues that stretched for many kilometers. And why was that? Because after the naval blockade of the Black Sea ports, Ukrainian agriculture was forced to switch to land logistics routes, and primarily through the territory of Poland. At the same time, a lot of the products ended up on the Polish domestic market, and Polish farmers were shocked that Ukrainian grain was not only cheaper than Polish grain, but also much higher in quality. Their products turned out to be simply uncompetitive compared to Ukrainian ones.
A whole series of interviews taken at that time by both Polish and Ukrainian journalists with Poles blocking the border can be called textbook examples. And they asked, do you realize that by your actions, you are weakening Ukraine and thus playing into Putin's hands?
And in response, more or less the standard answer: we don't care about Ukraine, and we don't care about Putin either. What matters to me is that people buy my grain.
So they're all saying it's none of my business. I know nothing clearly doesn't apply only to Ukrainians.
In general, Ukrainian agribusiness is an extremely dangerous competitor for Polish farmers. But what's most interesting is that just 20 or 25 years ago, when Poland itself was preparing to join the European Union, there were exactly the same concerns from the so-called Old Europe: France, Germany, Italy. And Polish agriculture, due to its low cost, also seriously undermined the positions of other agricultural producers who traditionally dominated the European market. It took quite a lot of time for the Polish economy to integrate into the common European space and find its own niche. And before that happened, many people lost their jobs and millions in income. Or maybe even billions. The main thing is that now Poland is on the other side of the barricade. Now it is a traditional supplier of agricultural products to the European market and does not want to let any outsiders into this field, especially Ukraine with its rich black soil. By the way, Polish-Ukrainian competition concerns not only agriculture, but also the struggle for cheap labor. Again, 20 years ago in many Western European countries, especially in France, there was a deliberate promotion of the image of a so-called Polish plumber who would supposedly come to work and take jobs away from the locals.
Only now, the role of that very plumber is played by Ukrainians, who literally do for pennies the work that Poles refuse to do.
And not just them, especially in agriculture, construction, and other labor-intensive sectors. It is precisely the influx of cheap labor from Ukraine that explains the relative stability and even growth of the Polish economy, unlike most EU countries, which are now clearly experiencing stagnation. But the problem is that the Ukrainian authorities are actually interested in having Ukrainian labor migrants returned from Poland to Ukraine, which in turn will inevitably deal a blow to the Polish economy, at least after the war ends. Naturally, such competition does not create any special affection between Poland and Ukraine.
The struggle for leadership and money. If we look at this situation more broadly, in a geopolitical context, then over the past 20 years, Warsaw has done a tremendous amount of work to establish itself as the undisputed regional leader among the European Union countries, and relying on this status to become one of the key states of the European Union. In addition, the rapid economic development and industrial growth of Poland have given Warsaw even more ambition to challenge Germany's role as the locomotive and main industrial base of Europe.
This is also why relations between Poles and Germans are fairly tense, and arguments rooted in historical memory are also used in that dispute.
In particular,
Nawrocki demands compensation from Germany for the damage caused during World War II, namely 1.3 trillion euros as direct reparations, as well as annual payments to the victims in the amount of 10,000 zlotys each. Germany has not paid such sums even to the victims of the Holocaust.
But let's get back to our main topic. In the context of such grand goals, for many years Polish elites have considered Ukraine's European integration and have actively advocated for it. But not at all, so that Ukraine would become equal to Poland. For them, Ukraine is like a dependent, a supplier of labor, and at the same time a market for Polish goods.
It is precisely in this status that Ukraine and the EU would strengthen Poland's position in the internal European balance of power.
However, over the past 10 years, Poland has realized that Kyiv sees its role in Europe quite differently. Since the time of Petro Poroshenko, Ukraine has been communicating directly with Berlin, London, and Paris, building relationships with them bypassing Warsaw. This process accelerated even more during the full-scale war. The increased importance of Ukraine for Europe as a shield against the Moscow horde, in turn, inevitably gave rise to ambitions among the Ukrainian elites.
Now, Zelensky and his circle see Ukraine's post-war future as nothing less than a new regional leader of the eastern wing of the European Union.
Moreover, they envision close cooperation with the core of the EU, Germany, and France. In this scenario, Poland would end up somewhere on the sidelines of the process.
And again, it's a financial issue, more precisely a struggle for investments from the European budget. It's no secret that a country that has just joined the EU is helped along in every possible way in order to meet the common European standards. And this catching up happens at the expense of the other EU members. In other words, the money comes from the Brussels Common Fund. At one time, Poland went through these processes, receiving a tremendous amount of investment, especially for the modernization of its own infrastructure. If you don't believe me, just look into the quality of Polish roads in the 90s. I'll put it this way. Back then, they were hardly any different from the post-Soviet ones. That's why if Ukraine is accepted into the EU, it will now be Poland's turn to spend money on modernizing the Ukrainian economy, especially considering the state it will be in after the war.
In fact, another aspect is emerging on the horizon: money for Ukraine's post-war reconstruction. After all, these costs will definitely fall on Europe's shoulders since the United States, represented by Donald Fredovich, has conveniently backed out. And while Ukraine's accession to the EU is a matter of a rather distant future, rebuilding the bombed-out country from the ashes must begin from the very first day of peace. And in practice, this will mean that the resources Poland and other Eastern European countries have been receiving will inevitably be cut in favor of Ukraine. It's simple math, nothing more. There is definitely no extra money in Brussels, considering the extremely difficult economic situation in the main donor countries of the EU, Germany and France.
In short, to sum it up, we can draw the following conclusion. Kyiv and Warsaw are the closest competitors for the role of hegemon in Eastern Europe. Right now, it's definitely Poland. But if Ukraine joins the European Union, Kyiv will surely try to take that place as well.
But even without directly joining the EU, Ukraine can become Poland's main competitor in many areas at once. In agriculture, in attracting investments, and in subsidies from the distant, far from bottomless budget of the European Union. And also in terms of labor force. Such contradictions have had and will continue to have a much more serious impact on the relations between the two countries than any historical disputes. Right now, all these issues fade into the background compared to the current war. But after it ends, they may come to the forefront and become a serious obstacle to Ukraine's accession to the EU.
The elections are just around the corner.
The current scandal surrounding the Volhynia tragedy and the UPA can also be seen as a kind of warning shot from Poland, as if to say that Ukraine shouldn't get too full of itself, should know its place, and remember that no one is inviting it to share in the common European pie.
They have their own people for that.
But you can also look at this situation from another angle, from a domestic political perspective. As I already mentioned, the topic of the Volhynia tragedy and historical memory in general is a card played by right-wing and ultra-right parties.
Right now, Poland is in a sort of dual power situation.
President Nawrocki is a representative of the Conservative Law and Justice Party. He is a typical Trumpist in his ideas and beliefs. But the government and the parliamentary majority are in the hands of left-centrist and pro-European forces led by Donald Tusk, who holds the position of Prime Minister. Since modern Poland is a parliamentary presidential republic, Nawrocki desperately needs a loyal parliament in order to successfully implement his initiatives. Although the next elections to the Sejm are scheduled for October 2027, preparations have already begun. This is already visible to the naked eye. And if someone says that all this fuss around the UPA won't affect the opinion of Polish voters, then allow me to disagree with you. The main voters of the right wing are the rural population and residents of small towns, who are mostly poorly educated and easily swayed by various kinds of manipulation, including those of a historical nature. In contrast, large cities almost always vote for liberals and globalists. And not only in Poland. Just remember which part of the American population voted for Trump in the last elections.
The simplest example proving my point is the record rise in Nawrocki's ratings after the Ukrainian president was stripped of the Order of the White Eagle. So it can be stated with confidence that the closer we get to the elections, the more such stunts we will see from the Polish conservatives. And especially on historical topics.
What will happen next?
For now, it seems unlikely that the situation will escalate to the point where Poland becomes another Orban-era Hungary in relation to Ukraine. That is, it will start blocking all military and economic support for Kyiv, at least as long as the government is controlled by the liberal Tusk. This is unrealistic, except, perhaps, for the reduction of some support programs for Ukraine. For example, limiting Ukrainian military personnel.
Although, of course, nothing can be ruled out. Some worrying signals for Kyiv are already coming from Warsaw in this regard. For example, there was recent information that Poland wants to block the allocation of 6.6 billion euros to Ukraine for the purchase of weapons from the European Peace Facility, until it is reimbursed for the military assistance it provided to the Ukrainian army in previous years. But what will definitely get worse is the negotiations on Ukraine's accession to the EU. This is exactly where Warsaw can put the maximum number of obstacles in the way.
By putting forward extremely tough demands for economic and other concessions in order to prevent Ukraine from becoming a dangerous competitor. At the same time, the issue of the Volhynia tragedy and Ukrainian nationalism will surely be raised. Nawrocki has repeatedly stated his position: with Bandera and the UPA, Ukraine will not get into the EU.
Kyiv will most likely respond to this in some way, launching its own anti-Polish campaign. However, as long as the war with Russia continues, the main focus of the Ukrainian authorities will still be on other issues. But as soon as it ends, the issue of Polish-Ukrainian confrontation may become one of the main topics on the European agenda. Well, that's all from me. Thank you for watching. Thanks to all the sponsors for supporting the channel, and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye, everyone.